Sorrel had flour in her hair, burn marks on her forearms, and absolutely no business being in the middle of the throne room. Yet, here she stood, barefoot on marble that cost more than her entire life, while the Alpha King's wolf circled her like she was the last warm loaf in the kingdom. The animal was immense. She had seen wolves before, every shifter in the realm had one, but this was something else entirely. Its shoulders reached her chest. Its fur was the color of a winter storm, dark silver streaked with black, and its eyes burned with a molten amber that radiated intelligence. Those eyes were locked on her with an intensity that suggested the creature had found something precious and had no intention of letting it go. In its mouth, clamped between teeth that could snap a femur like dry kindling, was her apron. Her apron. The one she had been wearing not 10 minutes ago while pulling honey cakes from the oven in the lower kitchens. The one that had been tied securely around her waist, until a blur of silver fur had barreled through the kitchen door, knocked over a rack of cooling bread, sent 3 apprentices screaming into the pantry, and ripped the apron clean off her body with surgical precision. It had not touched her skin, not a scratch, not a graze, not a single claw mark, just the apron, torn free and claimed like a war trophy. She had chased it. Of course she had chased it. That was her only good apron, the one without the patched hole on the hip, the one Marin had stitched her initials into on her last birthday, and she could not afford another one on a baker's wages. She had not been thinking about the fact that it was a wolf, or whose wolf it might be, or that chasing it would lead her through the servants' corridor, up the back stairs, past 2 bewildered guards who were too stunned to stop her, and directly into the throne room during what appeared to be a formal Luna selection ceremony. That last detail she had not known about, until she burst through the doors and skidded to a halt on the polished floor. Her feet, shoeless and flour-dusted, squeaked against the marble. The sound was deafening in the hush. 40 faces turned toward her, nobles in silk and velvet, their expressions frozen between outrage and disbelief. Council members with ceremonial chains draped across their shoulders, mid-conversation and now mid-gape. 6 women in exquisite gowns standing in a perfect line before the raised platform, each one lovelier than the last, each one clearly a Luna candidate selected from the finest bloodlines in the realm. Their hair was styled, their posture immaculate, their gowns worth more than Sorrel would earn in a decade. And on the platform itself, rising slowly from a throne carved from black stone, the Alpha King, King Calder Ashgrove. She knew his face the way everyone in the realm knew it. The portrait hung in every guild hall and every temple, but the portrait was a pale imitation of the real thing. It captured none of the sheer physical force of him, the way the air in the room seemed to bend around his presence, like heat distortion above a forge. He was tall in the way, mountains were tall, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw cut sharp enough to draw blood. His dark hair was pushed back from his face, and his eyes, pale gray, almost silver, found her across the room with the precision of an arrow finding its target. Sorrel stopped breathing. Her lungs simply refused to cooperate. Every cell in her body screamed at her to run, to bow, to melt into the marble and cease to exist. The wolf, his wolf, padded over to her and sat at her feet. It dropped the apron on the ground in front of her like an offering, then looked up with an expression she would have called smug if a wolf's face were capable of smugness. The silence that followed was catastrophic. One of the Luna candidates, a tall woman with copper hair and cheekbones that could cut glass, let out a sound of pure indignation. A council member dropped his goblet. Wine spread across the marble like a slow, red stain. Another noble took a step backward as if whatever was happening might be contagious. Sorrel looked down at the apron, looked at the wolf, looked at the king. "I am so sorry," she whispered. The wolf picked the apron back up, placed it on her feet again with great deliberation, and barked once. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a cannon shot, bouncing between the stone pillars and reverberating through Sorrel's rib cage. Then it lay down beside her and rested its head on her bare foot, letting out a long, contented sigh, as though this was exactly where it had always intended to end up. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The copper-haired Luna candidate looked like she might faint or commit murder, possibly both. Sorrel had never wanted to disappear more in her entire life. The room they put her in was not a cell, but it shared enough characteristics with one to make the distinction academic. Stone walls, bare and cold, a single wooden chair, no window. A door that she had heard lock from the outside the moment it closed. Sorrel sat with her hands clenched in her lap and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The apron lay across her knees, slightly damp with wolf saliva and dusted with flour that was beginning to dry into a fine crust. She smoothed it flat with trembling fingers and tried to think clearly, which was difficult, given that her brain seemed to be producing nothing but a high-pitched whine of panic. She had been removed from the throne room with what she could only call aggressive politeness. 2 guards had flanked her, gripping her elbows with the careful firmness of men handling something potentially explosive, while a thin-faced steward had murmured apologies to the assembled court over the disruption. The Luna candidates had watched her go, with expressions ranging from contempt to bewildered curiosity. She had caught one last glimpse of the king as they steered her out. He had been standing very still, at the edge of the platform, staring at the place where his wolf had lain at her feet, his expression unreadable as carved stone. The wolf itself had tried to follow her. She had heard it behind her, claws clicking on marble, and then a commotion, a snarl, Braith's sharp voice, and the king's own command, low and clipped, cutting through the chaos. Even then, the animal had let out a sound that followed her down the corridor, a long, low whine that vibrated in her ribs and made something deep inside her ache in a way she did not understand and did not want to examine. Now she sat alone and waited for whatever came next. She catalogued the possibilities. Banishment seemed likely. Imprisonment seemed possible. Execution seemed dramatic, but not entirely off the table, given that she had just interrupted a royal mating ceremony by chasing a wolf through the throne room while covered in flour and wearing no shoes. She did not have to wait long. The door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was lean, composed, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that revealed absolutely nothing. His clothes were fine, but not extravagant, tailored in dark gray wool with no ornamentation, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who wielded real power without needing to announce it. "My name is Braith," he said. "I serve as the king's second." Sorrel stood quickly, the chair scraping against stone. "My lord, I swear I did not do anything. I was just baking, and the wolf came into the kitchen and stole my apron, and I only chased it because it is my only good one. And I did not know there was a ceremony happening, and I would never have gone into the throne room if I had known. And I am so sorry about the wine someone dropped, although that was not technically my fault. And also I think the wolf knocked over several chairs on its way in, which I feel should be noted, was also not my doing." She ran out of breath and stopped. Braith studied her for a long moment, his expression betraying nothing. "What is your name?" "Sorrel, Vaith. I work in the lower kitchens under Marin, the head baker. How long have you worked in the palace?" 3 years in the kitchens, my lord. "But I have lived here my whole life. I was left on the kitchen steps as a baby. The household staff raised me until Marin took me on as her apprentice when I was 9. Something shifted in Braith's expression, subtle enough that she almost missed it. A flicker of interest, or perhaps calculation. "And in that time, have you ever had contact with the king? Spoken to him? Been in his presence?" "No. Never. I am a baker. I bake bread. I have never even been above the 2nd floor before today." "Have you ever interacted with his wolf before?" he asked. "I did not even know the king's wolf could just walk around on its own like that," Sorrel admitted. "Is that normal?" Because it did not seem normal. It seemed like the opposite of normal. Braith did not answer the question. Instead, he pulled the second chair from the corner, set it across from her, and sat down. He folded his hands on his knee and regarded her with the same careful neutrality. "What I am about to tell you does not leave this room," he said. "The king has been searching for a mate for over a year. The Luna selection you interrupted today was the fourth such ceremony. Every candidate presented to him, without exception, his wolf has rejected." Sorrel blinked. Rejected how? Violently, in most cases. One woman needed 7 stitches. Another was chased from the palace grounds at a dead sprint and did not stop running until she reached the village. The wolf cornered a duchess from the Northern Territories in the armory and growled at her for 40 minutes until we managed to coax it away with raw venison. He paused to let this settle. Today, there were 6 candidates. The wolf ignored all of them. It left the throne room before the ceremony even began, disappeared into the lower levels of the palace, and came back with your apron in its mouth. Sorrel stared at him, and then it just sat down. "It brought you a gift," Braith said. "In a year and a half of observing the wolf's behavior around potential mates, it has never done that, not once, not with anyone." The implication hovered between them, like smoke. "That cannot mean what you think it means," Sorrel said, her voice climbing higher. "I am a baker. I am aware. I have flour under my fingernails. Permanently it does not come out. Also aware. The king's mate is supposed to be someone important, someone noble, someone who does not smell like yeast, and have bread dough in her hair. And yet," Wraith said quietly, "his wolf chose you." Sorrel opened her mouth, closed it, and pressed her flour-dusted hands against her face. This was not happening. This could not be happening. She was nobody. She was less than nobody. She was a foundling who made bread. "What does the king think about all of this?" she asked through her fingers. Braith paused, and the pause lasted a beat too long for comfort. "The king's wolf has been acting independently of him for some time," he said carefully. "His Majesty and his wolf are not currently in agreement on many things." The chill that crawled down Sorrel's spine had nothing to do with the cold room. A king at war with his own wolf. She did not know much about shifter politics or pack dynamics, but she knew that much was dangerous. Deeply, terribly dangerous. A wolf and its host were supposed to be one being, 2 halves of the same soul. If they were at odds, if the wolf was acting on its own, something was profoundly wrong. "What happens now?" she asked. Braith stood and straightened his jacket. "Now, we find out if his wolf's reaction to you is a coincidence, or something else entirely." He moved to the door, opened it, and looked back at her. "Get some rest tonight, Miss Faith. Tomorrow you will be brought before the king." The door closed behind him. Sorrel heard the lock turn. She sat alone in the cold room, clutching her apron, and felt the ground beneath her feet shift into something vast and uncertain. The wolf's whine echoed in her memory, and that strange ache behind her ribs pulsed once, faintly, like a second heartbeat she had never noticed before. Sorrel did not sleep. She lay on the narrow cot in the small stone room and stared at the ceiling, and ran through every possible version of tomorrow in her head, each one worse than the last. By the time pale light crept under the door, she had convinced herself she would be banished, imprisoned, or fed to the wolf, possibly all 3 in that order. A knock came at dawn. A servant girl, young and wide-eyed with a scattering of freckles across her nose, brought a basin of warm water and a clean dress, not a fine dress. Plain linen, dove gray, but far better than the flour-caked clothes Sorrel had been wearing since the previous afternoon. "Braith sent it," the girl said, setting the basin on the chair. Then she hesitated, her curiosity clearly winning the battle against her professionalism. "Is it true the king's wolf brought you a present? In the middle of the Luna ceremony?" "It stole my apron," Sorrel corrected, wringing out the washcloth. "That is so romantic," the girl breathed. "It is theft," Sorrel replied, "and trespassing, and destruction of property, if you count the bread rack. The girl looked unconvinced, but said nothing more. Sorrel washed, dressed, and tied her hair back with a strip of cloth torn from her old apron, because it was the only familiar thing she had, and she needed something to anchor herself to. Her hands were steady, but only because she was concentrating very hard on keeping them that way. The servant girl led her through corridors she had never seen before, climbing higher into the palace than she had ever been. The kitchens occupied the lowest levels, a warm, noisy, flour-dusted world of ovens and kneading tables, and the constant smell of baking bread. Up here, everything was different. The stone was darker, heavier, the walls thicker. Tapestries, woven with scenes of hunts and battles, hung between iron sconces. The air was cooler and carried a scent she could not quite name, something sharp and clean, like cedar smoke and winter rain, and the metallic edge of a blade freshly drawn. It smelled like him, she realized. And then she shoved that thought into a locked cupboard at the back of her mind and refused to open it. Braith met her at a set of heavy oak doors reinforced with iron studs. He looked exactly as composed as he had the night before. Every hair in place, every button fastened, which Sorrel found mildly infuriating given that she felt like a wrung-out rag. "The king is inside," Braith said. "His wolf has been contained in an adjacent room. We want to introduce you in a controlled environment and observe the wolf's reaction." "Controlled how?" Sorrel asked. "The wolf will be released while you are in the room. I need you to stay calm, stay still, and let it approach you. Do not run. Do not make sudden movements. And if it decides to eat me instead of court me, then we will have misjudged the situation significantly," Braith said without a trace of humor. "But I do not believe that will happen." "That is not as comforting as you seem to think it is," Sorrel said. He pushed the doors open. The room beyond was large and high-ceilinged, built from the same dark stone as the rest of the upper palace. A fire burned low in a hearth broad enough to roast an ox. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with leather-bound volumes and rolled maps. A heavy desk dominated the center, scattered with reports and correspondence and a half-empty cup of something long gone cold. And standing behind that desk, arms folded across his chest, still as carved granite, was King Calder. He watched her enter the way a predator watches movement at the edge of a clearing, with total, unblinking focus. Sorrel's legs nearly buckled. The weight of his presence hit her like the blast of heat from an open oven door. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to bow, to kneel, to make herself small and invisible, the way she had spent her whole life making herself small and invisible. She did none of those things. Mostly because her legs had locked and refused to cooperate with any instruction, including retreat. "Miss Vaith," the king said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Quieter? Not the commanding bark of a ruler addressing a subject, but something closer to a low rumble of distant thunder, felt in the chest before it reached the ears. Something in her responded to it, an involuntary vibration behind her ribs that matched his frequency, and she had no idea what to do with that. "Your Majesty," she managed, "I am sorry about yesterday, about the ceremony, and the apron, and the bread rack your wolf destroyed on its way through the kitchen. There were 6 loaves of sourdough on that rack, and they had taken 12 hours to prove. So if there is a way to file a formal complaint about wolf-related bread damage, I would appreciate knowing the process." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile. Not quite, but the hard line of his mouth softened by a fraction, and his eyebrows lifted a degree. "Noted," he said. Braith closed the doors behind her and moved to stand near the far wall. Sorrel noticed he positioned himself between her and the side exit, though whether that was for her protection or to prevent her from bolting, she could not tell. "Release him," the king said. A door at the far side of the room opened, and the wolf emerged. It was just as immense as she remembered, filling the doorway with storm-colored fur and predatory grace. But it moved differently now. Yesterday had been chaos, a hurricane of speed, and single-minded determination tearing through the kitchens. Today, the wolf walked slowly, deliberately, each paw placed with care. Its gaze, fixed on Sorrel with an intensity that made every hair on her arms stand upright. It crossed the room in measured strides, ignoring the king entirely, ignoring Braith, ignoring the fire and the furniture and everything in the world that was not her. Sorrel held her breath, her nails dug into her palms. The wolf stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from its body, close enough to count the individual guard hairs along its muzzle, dark at the roots and tipped with pale ash. It was beautiful in the way a storm was beautiful, awe-inspiring and absolutely terrifying and utterly indifferent to whether you survived the encounter. It pressed its nose against her stomach and inhaled deeply. The breath was warm through the thin linen of her dress. Then it exhaled, a long, shuddering release, and its entire body relaxed. The tension she had not even realized the animal was carrying simply dissolved, as though every muscle had unclenched at once. Its legs folded beneath it, and it sank to the floor at her feet, curling its body around her ankles like a cat settling before a hearth. A sound rolled from its chest, not a growl, not a purr, something between, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone floor and up through the soles of her bare feet and settled somewhere behind her ribs like a key turning in a lock. Sorrel looked at the king. Calder had gone pale. He was gripping the edge of the desk with both hands, knuckles white, the tendons in his forearms standing out like cords. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. His silver eyes were wide, and what she saw in them was not anger, not frustration, but something far more complicated. Something that looked like recognition and dread and a fear so old it had worn grooves into his expression. "It has never done that," Braith said from the wall, his composure cracking for the first time since she had met him. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Not with anyone, not once." The wolf sighed against her feet, utterly content, and closed its eyes. Sorrel stood frozen in the king's study, with a wolf the size of a small horse curled around her legs, looking at a king who appeared to be having some kind of internal crisis that she was not remotely equipped to manage, and thought very clearly that her life had just changed in a way she could not undo. "Well," she said into the silence, "because someone had to say something. At least it did not steal my apron this time." Nobody laughed. The fire crackled. The wolf thumped its tail once against the stone floor, and Sorrel could have sworn it was smiling. The arrangement, when it came, was not what Sorrel had expected. She had imagined something dramatic. A royal decree, perhaps, or a formal contract stamped with the Ashgrove seal and witnessed by 6 council members. Instead, Braith appeared at the kitchen door the following morning and said, simply, "The wolf escaped again. It is sitting outside the bakery. Could you come and collect it, please?" Sorrel wiped her hands on her new apron, the old one having been claimed permanently by the wolf as some kind of trophy, and followed him into the courtyard. The wolf was indeed sitting outside the bakery entrance, its tail sweeping the cobblestones in slow, patient arcs. A guardsman stood 10 paces away, looking deeply uncertain about his life choices. When the wolf saw her, it stood padded over and pressed its head against her hip with enough force to knock her sideways a step. "Good morning to you as well," Sorrel muttered, scratching behind its ear without thinking. The wolf made a sound like a kettle sighing and leaned its full weight into her hand. She braced her feet and held firm, though just barely. This became the pattern. Every morning, the wolf found her. It did not matter where Braith and the guards secured it. It chewed through leather restraints in minutes. It shouldered open bolted doors with a persistence that bordered on obsessive. It picked one lock with its claws, which should not have been physically possible, but which 3 separate witnesses confirmed. Once, according to a horrified steward who was still shaking when he reported it, it climbed through a second-story window, dropped 15 feet into a courtyard, and trotted to the bakery as though this were a perfectly reasonable morning routine. By the 3rd day, they stopped trying to contain it. His Majesty requests that you carry out your duties in the upper kitchens, Braith told her, his tone carefully neutral in a way that suggested this was not truly a request, so much as a royal command wrapped in polite fabric. A workspace has been arranged, adjacent to the king's study. The wolf can remain with you during the day, without disrupting the rest of the household. Adjacent? Sorrel repeated. To the king's study? Connected by an archway, Braith confirmed. You will have your own oven, your own workspace, and full access to whatever supplies you require. And so Sorrel, a foundling baker, who had never been above the second floor before last week, found herself baking bread in a room connected to the Alpha King's private study by an arched doorway with no door. Just an open passage through which the smell of rising bread drifted one way, and the scratch of a pen drifted the other. She could hear him working, the steady rhythm of his pen, on parchment. The low murmur of his voice when advisors came and went, clipped and measured, each word carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The occasional sharp sound of a report being dropped onto the desk with more force than necessary, followed by a silence that suggested its contents had been disappointing. The wolf split its time between them, padding back and forth through the archway like a restless child unable to choose between parents. It would lie beside the king's desk for a stretch, its chin on its paws, watching him work. Then something would shift, some invisible pull, and it would rise and drift back to Sorrel's kitchen, settling near the warmth of her oven with a contented exhale. It always returned to her. Every time. Calder never came through the archway. Not once, in those first days. He existed on the other side of a wall of stone and propriety, close enough to hear, close enough to smell when the wind from the open window carried his scent through the passage, that cedar and iron and winter rain smell that made her pulse skip in a way she refused to acknowledge. But Sorrel noticed things. She noticed that when she baked cinnamon bread, the king's pen went quiet for long stretches, as though the scent had stolen his concentration, and he could not find where it had gone. She noticed that a book about traditional baking customs appeared on the shelf nearest the archway, its spine uncracked, positioned at exactly her eye level, as though someone had placed it there for her, but could not bring himself to say so. On the fourth morning, she found a set of copper measuring cups beside her workspace. They were old, beautifully made, etched with vine patterns along the handles that had been worn smooth by years of use. They were not palace issue. They were personal, someone's treasured tools, offered without explanation or attribution. "Did you leave these for me?" she asked the wolf, knowing perfectly well it had no means of acquiring copper kitchenware or, for that matter, shopping. The wolf yawned so wide she could count every tooth, then dropped its head back onto its paws. From the study, she heard the faintest sound. It might have been a cleared throat. It might have been nothing at all. Sorrel hid her smile in her work and said nothing more about it. The quiet thaw happened in the spaces between their separate lives. Sorrel talked while she baked, the way she always had, narrating her process to no one in particular, because silence made the work feel lonely. She described the texture of the dough beneath her hands, the way good flour felt different from cheap flour, the precise moment when bread was ready to come out of the oven, and how she knew by the hollow sound it made when she tapped the bottom. She complained about the temperamental new oven, which ran hot on the left side and cool on the right. She told stories about Marin, the head baker who had taken her in at 9 years old and who believed with religious conviction that every problem in the world, from heartbreak to border disputes, could be solved with enough butter and enough patience. It never occurred to her that anyone was listening. She was talking to herself, or to the wolf, or to the bread, the way bakers did. Until one afternoon when she mentioned, offhandedly, that her sourdough starter had been left behind in the lower kitchens when she moved upstairs, and it was probably dead by now, and she mourned it because she had been cultivating that starter for 2 years, and it had been her best one. The next morning, a ceramic crock appeared beside her station. It was glazed, a deep blue, handsome, and sturdy, and inside was a perfect, bubbling sourdough starter, alive and active and smelling exactly right. "This is at least 3 weeks old," Sorrel said aloud, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had been tending starters since she was tall enough to reach the counter. "Someone has been feeding this daily." "Yes." "The hydration ratio is perfect. The smell is clean." Silence from the study. "It is exceptional, actually," she continued, lifting the crock and inhaling. "Whoever made this has real skill. I am genuinely impressed." More silence, but of a different quality entirely, the kind of silence that was holding its breath. "Drath, are you going to make me guess?" Sorrel asked, directing the question at the archway. A long pause. Then, from the study, very quietly, the baking book had instructions. Sorrel pressed her lips together hard to keep from grinning. The king of the realm had read a baking book and made her a sourdough starter. She was going to treasure that information for the rest of her life. That evening, as Sorrel packed up her station and untied her apron, the king appeared in the archway for the first time. He leaned against the stone frame, arms crossed, filling the space with his shoulders in a way that made the passage seem half its actual width. He watched her wipe down the counter, his expression guarded, but present. "The starter," he said. "Is it truly adequate? I was uncertain about the flour ratio." "It is the best starter anyone has ever given me," Sorrel replied, not looking up. "Thank you, Your Majesty." A pause that stretched like pulled dough. "Calder," he said. Sorrel's hands went still on the counter. She looked up slowly. "When we are here," he continued, his voice carefully neutral, each word chosen with the precision of a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. "In this space, Calder is sufficient." She held his gaze. The firelight from her oven played across his features, softening the sharp angles, catching the silver in his eyes and turning it warm. For just a moment, the mask slipped. Beneath the control, beneath the authority, beneath the weight of the crown and the war and whatever was tearing him and his wolf apart, she saw something unguarded, something uncertain, something that looked achingly, unmistakably. "Calder," she said, testing the shape of it in her mouth. It felt important. It felt like a door opening. His wolf, sprawled by the oven in a patch of residual warmth, thumped its tail twice against the stone floor. And Calder almost smiled. Sorrel learned the king's rhythms, the way she learned the rhythms of bread. Slowly, through repetition, through close attention to the subtle signs that told her when things were rising well and when they were about to collapse. He worked too much. That was the first thing. The candles in his study burned past midnight every night, and when she arrived in the early morning to light her ovens, the previous day's candles had melted into flat, waxy graves on the desk, their wicks drowned in pools of hardened tallow. He ate only when reminded, and sometimes not even then. Braith brought trays that sat untouched for hours, the food going cold and stale, until Sorrel started leaving fresh rolls on the corner of his desk without comment. They always disappeared. She never saw him eat them. They simply ceased to exist, as though the king could accept kindness only when no one was watching. He was careful around her, deliberate in his distance, precise in his courtesy, as though he had drawn a line on the floor between them and was determined never to cross it. Every word he spoke to her was measured, weighed, stripped of anything that might be mistaken for warmth. But the wolf crossed that line constantly, and through the wolf, Sorrel felt things she could not explain and could not ignore. A warmth that bloomed in her chest when she was near him. A low, tugging ache that settled in her bones when she walked away at the end of the day. A prickling awareness of his presence that hummed beneath her skin like a second pulse. Always there, always pulling. She told herself it was the wolf's influence. Proximity, nothing more. A side effect of whatever strange bond the animal had decided existed between them. She was not developing feelings for the king. That would be absurd. She was a baker. Bakers did not have feelings for kings. They had feelings about flour quality and oven temperatures, and whether the sourdough had risen properly. She almost believed it. Then came the evening, everything fractured. Sorrel had stayed late, experimenting with a cardamom and orange peel recipe that Marin had given her years ago, but that she had never perfected. The kitchen smelled of warm spice and citrus, and the wolf dozed by the oven, twitching occasionally in its sleep. The study beyond the archway had gone quiet. She assumed Calder had retired, though she had not heard him leave. Then a crash echoed from the study, not the sound of something dropped, not a book falling or a cup knocked from a desk. The sound of something breaking apart from the inside. She ran through the archway and stopped dead. Calder was on his knees in the middle of the room. His hands were braced flat against the stone floor, fingers splayed and clawed, and his body was shaking violently, not trembling, convulsing. His spine arched at an angle that looked wrong, inhuman, and a sound was tearing from his throat that made every hair on her body stand on end. It was low and guttural and agonized, caught somewhere between a human groan and a wolf's snarl, as though two voices were fighting for the same mouth. His wolf stood on the far side of the room, fully manifested, and Sorrel's blood went cold, because the wolf should not have been there. Not like that. Not as a separate, physical creature while he was still in human form. A shifter's wolf and human body were one being. They did not exist independently. They could not exist independently, not without something going catastrophically wrong. "Calder!" she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. His head snapped toward her. His eyes were wrong. The left one was silver, human and wild with pain. The right burned amber, lupin, and unfocused, as though the wolf were looking out from behind his face. Human and beast were fighting for the same body, and the battle was tearing him apart. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not to hurt her, but to anchor himself, to hold on to something solid, while the ground beneath him gave way. The bones of his fingers shifted beneath the skin, caught between two forms, and the pain radiating through his grip was so intense she nearly cried out. "Get out!" he forced through clenched teeth. "Sorrel, get out! Now! I am not leaving you like this. You do not understand what is happening." His voice cracked, splitting between registers, half his own and half something deeper. "I cannot hold it. The wolf is pulling free, and if it separates completely while you are here, I do not know what it will do. What I will do, I cannot promise you will be safe." The wolf took a step toward them from across the room. Its gaze was fixed entirely on Sorrel, the gold in its eyes blazing, and what she saw in those eyes made her breath catch hunger, but not for food. Possession. A desperate, consuming need that had nothing to do with the man kneeling beside her and everything to do with claiming her as its own. The wolf did not want to hurt her. It wanted to have her. And it was willing to rip itself free of its own host to get closer. "It wants you." Calder ground out, sweat beading along his jaw. "It has been getting worse. Every day you are near me, the wolf pulls further from me because it wants to be closer to you, and it is tearing me apart to get there." Sorrel's world tilted on its axis. The wolf was not bonding with her as part of him. It was abandoning him to do it. Every moment she spent in this room, every bread roll she left on his desk, every quiet evening, with the wolf at her feet, she had been unknowingly pulling his soul in half. The splitting eased. Slowly, terribly, Calder's bones settled back into place. His breathing came in ragged, broken gasps, and sweat dripped from his jaw onto the stone floor. The wolf across the room shimmered once, twice, its form flickering like a candle in wind, then dissolved, pulling back inside him with a reluctance that Sorrel felt like a physical tug against her own ribs. Calder slumped forward until his forehead nearly touched the ground. For a long moment, the only sound was his breathing, harsh and uneven, and the distant crackle of the fire. "How long?" Sorrel whispered, her hand still caught in his weakening grip. "How long has this been happening?" He did not answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion. "Since the mountain campaign," he said. "It started as restlessness, A disagreement I could feel beneath my skin, as though the wolf and I no longer saw the world the same way. Then it began manifesting without my permission. Brief flashes at first. A paw where my hand should be, gold in my eyes when I looked in the mirror. Then, longer separations. The healers have no explanation. The wolf is rejecting me as its host, and I cannot stop it. Sorrel felt the words land like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples outward. "Can it survive without you?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "No," Calder said, "and neither can I without it. When the separation becomes permanent, we both die." The fire crackled. Inside him, the wolf pulsed, once through whatever thread connected the three of them. And what Sorrel felt was not anger or possession, but anguish, raw and bottomless and inconsolable. "That is why the Luna selections," she whispered, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "You were not looking for a mate. You were looking for someone the wolf would accept, someone who could keep it tethered to you." "An anchor?" Calder lifted his head, the look on his face, stripped bare of every defense, every wall, every carefully maintained mask of authority, confirmed everything. "And it chose a baker," Sorrel said, her voice cracking on the last word. "I am sorry," he said. The words came out stripped bare of everything except exhaustion and shame. "You should never have been pulled into this. You should not have seen that, and you should not be part of this." He withdrew his hand from hers and stood unsteady, gripping the edge of the overturned desk for balance. When he spoke again, his voice had gone cold and controlled, the king reassembling himself from the wreckage of the man. "This arrangement is over," he said, not looking at her. "You will return to the lower kitchens tomorrow morning. I will not use you as a leash for my own wolf. I will not put you in danger because my body is failing. Calder, you cannot make that decision alone, not when it affects both of us." "I am the king," he said, and the words were a wall, high and thick and final. "I can, and I have. Braith will escort you out." Sorrel stood there, flour on her hands, cardamom under her nails, her heart hammering against her ribs, and watched the walls rebuild themselves behind his eyes. She wanted to argue, wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until the stubbornness fell out. Wanted to scream that sending her away would fix nothing, that the wolf would come for her again, that she could feel something between them that was real and important and terrifying and worth fighting for. But his back was turned, and his shoulders were rigid, and the dismissal was absolute. She left without another word in the corridor. Alone, Sorrel pressed her back against the cold stone wall and wrapped her arms around herself. Her wrist still burned where he had gripped it. Her chest ached with something vast and nameless that she refused, absolutely refused, to call heartbreak. He was dying. The wolf was tearing itself free, and he was dying, and he had just sent away the only person in the world it would stay for. 3 days without the wolf felt like learning to breathe with one lung. Sorrel returned to the lower kitchens as instructed. Marin took one look at her face, set down the rolling pin she had been wielding, and asked nothing. She simply handed Sorrel a bowl of dough and pointed at the kneading table. The familiar rhythm should have helped. The push and fold, the patient repetition, the warm yeast smell that had been Sorrel's whole world before a wolf had torn through it, carrying her apron and her future in its teeth. It did not help. Her hands shook, not from cold, not from strain, but from something inside her that had come loose and refused to settle. The warmth she had grown used to, that low, steady hum beneath her skin whenever she was near Calder, had gone silent. In its place was a hollow, so deep, she could feel the edges of it every time she drew breath, as though someone had scooped something essential out of her chest and left the cavity open. She overkneaded the morning batch. The bread came out dense and flavorless, which had not happened to her since she was 12. Marin examined a loaf, broke it open, sniffed it, and set it aside without comment. The look she gave Sorrel was worse than any criticism. On the second day, the headaches began. a dull, persistent pressure behind her eyes that no amount of water or sleep or willow bark tea could ease. By the afternoon, her vision blurred at the edges, and she had to grip the counter with both hands when the room tilted beneath her like the deck of a ship. "You look gray," Marin said, pressing the back of her weathered hand to Sorrel's forehead. "No fever. When did you last eat a proper meal?" "This morning," Sorrel lied. She had not eaten since yesterday. Everything tasted like ash and sawdust, and the smell of food, which had been the great comfort of her entire life, turned her stomach. Marin's eyes narrowed, but she did not push. Not yet. On the third day, the wolf howled. Sorrel heard it from the kitchen's 3 floors below, and half a palace away, separated by stone and wood, and distance that should have muffled the sound into insignificance. But it cut through every barrier like a blade through bread. It was not the howl of an animal calling to its pack, or marking its territory or singing at the moon. It was grief given a voice. Raw and endless and devastating, it rose and fell in long, agonizing waves that went on until the kitchen apprentices stopped working and stared at each other with wide, frightened eyes. "What is that?" one of them whispered. Sorrel gripped the edge of the kneading table and squeezed her eyes shut. Through whatever invisible thread connected her to the wolf, to him the animal's anguish poured through the thread between them. Its fury at being caged, at being kept from her, and beneath the wolf's pain, deeper and quieter, and somehow worse, she felt Calder's. The sensation of being ripped apart from the inside, of holding himself together through sheer will, while the seams split one by one. She bit down on her lip until she tasted copper. She did not cry. She did not run to him. Both cost her more than she would ever admit. By the 4th day, she could barely stand. Marin found her sitting on the kitchen floor at dawn, her back against the warm stone base of the oven, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face buried in the crook of her elbow. She had not slept, could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the bond stretching thinner between them, fraying at the edges like a rope pulled past its breaking point, and the terror of that fraying kept her awake, and staring, and slowly falling apart. "Child," Marin said. The old baker lowered herself to the floor beside Sorrel, with the careful deliberation of a woman whose knees had strong opinions about sitting on stone. She settled with a groan and folded her flour-dusted hands in her lap. "Tell me what is happening, and do not say you are fine. I have known you since you were 9 years old and could not reach the top shelf, and you have never once been fine when you said you were." So Sorrel told her. Not everything. Not about the king's wolf tearing itself free, or the horrifying moment of the splitting, when his bones had shifted beneath her hand and his eyes had divided between human and beast. But enough. The arrangement. The wolf choosing her. The connection she could not name. The way his proximity had become necessary, vital, woven into her biology in ways she did not understand. The dismissal. The growing emptiness that was eating her from the inside. Marin listened without interrupting. Her face was steady, her eyes sharp, her presence as solid and grounding as the stone at their backs. "He sent you away to protect you," Marin said when Sorrel had finished. "He sent me away because he is stubborn and proud, and determined to suffer alone rather than accept help from someone he considers beneath him. Those are not mutually exclusive," Marin observed mildly. She reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Sorrel's ear, the way she had done 1,000 times since Sorrel was a girl. "You care for him." Sorrel pressed her forehead against her knees and said nothing. "More than care," Marin added gently. "It does not matter what I feel," Sorrel said, her voice muffled. "He will not let me help. He would rather die than let a baker girl save him." "Then make him," Marin said. The words were simple and certain, the way Marin said everything, as though the world were made of problems that could be solved if you just rolled up your sleeves and got flour on your hands. Sorrel lifted her head. "He is the king, Marin, and you are the woman his wolf chose over every noble lady in the entire realm, over duchesses and diplomats and high-born daughters with pedigrees longer than my arm. Marin's eyes were fierce. That counts for something, child. That counts for quite a lot. Kings are just men with bigger chairs. They are as foolish and frightened as the rest of us. Sometimes more so, because no one ever tells them they are being stupid. The word settled into Sorrel's chest, like warm bread, fresh from the oven, solid and sustaining, filling some small part of the hollow. But before she could respond, the palace shuddered. It was subtle at first. A vibration in the stone beneath them, a rattle of pans on their hooks, a ripple across the surface of the water bucket by the door. Then it came again, stronger, and from somewhere far above them, a sound tore through the palace that was not a howl and not a roar, but something between the two, something primal and enormous and utterly terrifying, like the earth itself was screaming. The apprentices scrambled for the door. Marin gripped Sorrel's arm with surprising strength. That was not the wolf, Marin said, her face pale beneath its permanent dusting of flour. That was something else entirely. But Sorrel was already running. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her weakened body screaming in protest, her vision darkening and brightening in sickening pulses with every flight. The upper corridors were chaos. Guards sprinting, their swords drawn. Servants pressed flat against the walls, hands over their ears. A council member sat on the floor clutching his temple, blood seeping between his fingers from where falling debris had struck him. She heard shouting, heard Braith's voice cutting through the noise with sharp, controlled commands, heard the terrible sound again, closer now, vibrating through the floor beneath her bare feet, like a heartbeat made of thunder. She rounded the corner to the king's study and stopped. The door was gone. Not open, gone, shattered outward into the corridor in a spray of splintered oak and twisted iron hinges. Inside, the study was destroyed. The desk lay on its side, cracked nearly in half. Bookshelves had toppled like dominoes. Maps and reports and broken glass carpeted the floor. Her oven, visible through the archway, had a crack running through its front panel. And in the center of it all stood the wolf. But it was wrong. Larger than she had ever seen it, its storm-colored fur bristling upward along its spine, its body wreathed in a faint shimmer of heat that warped the air around it. Its eyes were wild and unfocused, the gold in them fractured, rolling in their sockets, and it swung its head from side to side, a low, continuous growl pouring from its throat like the sound of grinding stone. Beside it, crumpled against the overturned desk, was Calder. He was conscious, barely. One hand was outstretched toward the wolf that had ripped itself halfway free of him, fingers grasping at empty air. His face was the color of old ash. His face was drawn tight with pain, dark veins visible at his temples, and his body flickered at the edges, shifting between forms in agonizing, involuntary pulses that made Sorrel's stomach lurch. "Stay back," Braith commanded from behind her. His voice was steady, but she could hear the fracture beneath it. Sorrel ignored him. She stepped through the ruined doorway, her bare feet crunching on broken glass that she did not feel because nothing in the world mattered except reaching him. The wolf's head snapped toward her. For one terrible suspended heartbeat, she thought it would charge. Then it caught her scent. The growling stopped, cut off mid-rumble, as though someone had closed a valve. The bristling fur flattened against its body. Palled, unfocused amber of its eyes, sharpened, cleared, and fixed on her with the same overwhelming, single-minded intensity she had first seen in the throne room. A lifetime and a world ago, it knew her. It had always known her. Sorrel walked forward. Every step felt like walking into a furnace, the heat of the wolf's fractured energy pressing against her skin. She knelt beside Calder on the glass-strewn floor and took his hand in both of hers. "You absolute fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. His fingers closed around hers, weak and desperate, clinging to her the way a drowning man clings to wreckage. The wolf lowered itself to the ground, pressing its body against both of them, and let out a sound that was neither howl nor growl, but something she had never heard before. A whimper, soft and broken and pleading. The sound of a creature, begging for the one thing it needed to survive. The flickering stopped. Calder's body steadied. His breathing, ragged and shallow and wrong, began to even out, each exhale coming a little deeper, a little calmer. Braith stood in the ruined doorway, his careful composure finally shattered, and stared at them. 3 days, Sorrel said to him, tears streaming down her face, her hand locked in Calder's grip, her knees cut from the glass she was kneeling on and did not care about. He lasted 3 days. So did I. This arrangement is not over. It was never over, and if anyone tries to separate us again, I will make this wolf's tantrum look like a tea party. Nobody argued with her. Nobody dared. They moved him to his chambers. It took Braith, 2 guards, and Sorrel refusing to release his hand to get him there. The wolf had retreated back inside him after the crisis, but the damage was visible in every line of his body. His skin was ashen, dark hollows carved beneath his eyes so deep they looked like bruises, and every few minutes his body shuddered with aftershocks, small involuntary shifts that rippled beneath his skin like stones dropped into still water. Sorrel sat beside the bed and did not leave. She held his hand and watched his chest rise and fall and counted each breath, the way she counted minutes when bread was in the oven, with fierce, focused attention, as though looking away might cause something to collapse. Braith posted guards at the door, sent for the court healers, and then stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the king with an expression Sorrel had never seen on his composed face before. Naked fear. Not the controlled concern of an advisor or the measured worry of a strategist, but the raw, undisguised terror of a man watching his closest friend die by inches. The healers came. They examined the king. They spoke in low, grim voices, used words like unprecedented and accelerating and irreversible, and left without offering a single solution. Braith watched them go with his jaw set hard enough to crack stone. He has days, Braith said quietly, once they were gone. Perhaps a week, if the wolf stays settled. But it will not stay settled. It has never stayed settled for long. It will, if I am here, Sorrel said. For how long? Braith asked. You felt what the separation does to you. It nearly killed you both in 3 days. Being together slows the fracture, but it does not heal it. This is not sustainable. It is a bandage on a wound that needs stitching. Then we stitch it, Sorrel said. But first I need to understand what caused this. Not the symptoms. Not the splitting. Not the wolf acting independently. Not the seizures. The root, what broke them apart in the first place. Braith studied her for a long moment. She watched the calculation behind his eyes. The weighing of loyalties and oaths and secrets kept for 18 months. Then something shifted, some decision made, and he pulled a chair from the corner of the room, set it beside hers, and sat down. The Mountain Campaign, he said, 18 months ago. A border conflict with a faction called the Greyclaw Accord, separatists who believed the crown had abandoned the outer territories to poverty and neglect. They were not entirely wrong, which made the situation more complicated than any of us wanted it to be. He paused, choosing his next words with care. Calder marched to negotiate, not to fight. He went with a diplomatic envoy, not a war party. But the Greyclaw leadership refused to meet. They ambushed the envoy, killed 4 of our people, including a young attaché who had been married for less than a year. Sorrel's stomach tightened. She held Calder's limp hand tighter. After that, negotiation was no longer possible. There was a military campaign, brief but brutal. And there was a village called Thornfeld, caught between the 2 forces. The separatists had embedded their fighters among the civilian population. Intelligence reports indicated that the Greyclaw leadership was hiding there, using the village as a shield. He stopped speaking. The fire crackled in the hearth, absurdly domestic, against the weight of what he was describing. His wolf wanted to wait, Braith continued, his voice dropping. The wolf could sense the civilians. It wanted to approach slowly, evacuate the innocents, find the fighters through scent and patience. But the window was closing. Every hour of delay cost lives on the eastern ridge, where our soldiers were pinned down and dying. Calder made the tactical decision to advance. How many? Sora whispered. 43 civilians, Braith said. Caught in the crossfire, men and women and children, a healer trying to reach the wounded. A grandmother who would not leave her home. He paused. The separatist leadership was eliminated. The war ended within the week. By every strategic measure, the decision was correct. It saved hundreds of soldiers who would have died on that ridge. But the wolf, Sorrel said, understanding settling over her like cold water. The wolf has not forgiven him, Braith confirmed, and Calder has not forgiven himself. The separation began that night. He had forced the wolf down to make the call, overrode its instincts, denied its nature, buried it, and gave the order, and watched those people die with the wolf howling inside him to stop. He met Sorrel's eyes. The wolf has been trying to tear itself free ever since. Not because it is cruel, because he silenced it when it mattered most, and it will not be silenced again. Sorrel looked at Calder, lying on the dark sheets, unconscious and pale. The man who carried the weight of 43 lives and a wolf's broken trust, and would not let anyone help him hold it. This was not an illness. This was not a curse, cast by an enemy or a poison, slipped into his wine. This was a man at war with himself, and the battlefield was his own body. And he was losing. She stayed beside him, through the night. The fire burned low and was rebuilt by a servant who came and went without speaking. Braith remained for the first few hours, then left to manage the chaos in the palace, promising to return at dawn. Sorrel sat in the quiet and held the king's hand and thought about bread, about how dough resisted at first, pushed back against your hands, refused to be shaped, about how the only way to make it yield was patience and warmth, and the willingness to keep working, even when progress was invisible, about how the best bread came from the longest, slowest process, not from force. When Calder woke, it was gradual, a shift in his breathing, a tightening of his hand around hers that he had been holding in his sleep. His eyes opened, silver, both of them, which meant the wolf was deep inside and quiet. He looked at the ceiling, then at her hand in his, then at her face. "You are still here," he said, his voice rough and disbelieving. "I am still here," she confirmed. He looked at the flower, still caught in the creases of her knuckles, at the small cut on her palm from the glass she had knelt on, at the circles beneath her eyes that mirrored his own. Something in his expression crumbled, the way a wall crumbles when the mortar has been weakened too long. "I killed them," he said. 43 people. I felt my wolf screaming at me to stop, begging me to wait, and I buried it so deep I could not hear it anymore. And I gave the order. And now, it is leaving me, and I deserve it. I deserve every moment of this. "You made an impossible decision in an impossible situation," Sorrel said steadily. "I made the wrong one. Maybe you did, or maybe there was no right one. Maybe that is the truth. Nobody wants to say that sometimes there is no good choice, only less terrible ones, and someone has to make the call, and it happened to be you." She leaned forward. "But punishing yourself by letting the wolf rip you apart does not bring those 43 people back. It does not undo Thornfeld. It does not fix anything. It just adds one more body to the count. And it happens to be the body I am trying to save." He flinched. She had not meant to be cruel, but she would not pad the truth with soft words. Not now. Not when the truth was the only thing sharp enough to cut through 18 months of fortified guilt. "You locked your wolf away because you were afraid of what it wanted," she continued. "You were afraid that its mercy was weakness. That listening to it, waiting, showing patience, would cost more lives than the alternative. But its mercy was not weakness, Calder. It was the part of you that remembers you are more than a king making calculations. more than a strategist weighing numbers on a field. And you abandoned it. You betrayed the half of yourself that wanted to do the right thing. And it has been howling ever since. His jaw clenched, his eyes glistened bright and wet. I know something about being abandoned, Sorrel said, her voice dropping to something raw and unguarded that she had never let anyone hear before. I was left on the kitchen steps of this palace when I was 3 days old. Wrapped in a flour sack, no name pinned to my clothes, no note, no explanation, just a baby on a doorstep, thrown away before she was a week old. Her eyes held his without wavering. I spent my whole life believing I was not enough. That I had to earn my place by being useful, because if I stopped being useful for one single day, someone would throw me away again the way my parents did. I made myself small. I stayed quiet. I baked bread and kept my head down and never asked for anything, because I was terrified that the price of wanting something was losing everything. She squeezed his hand. But I was wrong, and so are you. You are more than the worst thing you have ever done, and your wolf knows that. It has always known that. It is not trying to destroy you, Calder. It is trying to make you listen. He stared at her. His breathing had gone shallow, his grip on her hand fierce enough to ache. She watched the war play out behind his eyes. The guilt fighting the hope, the shame fighting the desperate, terrified desire to believe her. "Why are you here?" he asked. And the question was not about the room, it was about everything. Why she had stayed when he pushed her away, why she had come back when he told her not to. Why she cared about a man who had done nothing but reject her help at every turn. "Because your wolf chose me," Sorrel said. "And because I am choosing you. Not because you are a king. Not because some magical bond compels me. Because you made a sourdough starter from a book you read in secret, and because you left me copper measuring cups and pretended you did not, and because when you laugh, which you almost never do, it sounds like the first good thing that has happened to you in a very long time." He kissed her. It was not graceful. He surged upward, his hand sliding into her hair, and his mouth found hers with a desperation that stole every thought from her head. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, pouring everything she had been holding back into the place where their lips met. "I do not deserve this," he said against her mouth. "Too late," she whispered back. "I already decided." He laughed, broken and wet and genuine, and kissed her, again deeper, slower. His thumb traced the line of her jaw like he was memorizing the shape of her, committing every angle and curve to a place inside him where it could not be lost. Inside him, the wolf stirred. She felt it through the bond, not pulling away this time, not straining toward her at his expense, but pressing forward gently, curving toward the place where their bodies met. The warmth flooded through her, amber and gold and achingly tender, and something clicked into alignment deep inside her chest. A key, turning in a lock she had not known existed. A door opening onto a room that had been waiting, empty and patient, for someone to walk through it. He pulled her onto the bed, and she went willingly. What followed was tender and overwhelming, and entirely theirs, a claiming and a surrender that were somehow the same thing, two people who had spent their lives, holding themselves apart, finally choosing to hold each other instead. When it was over, he pressed his forehead against hers, breathing hard, and whispered her name like it was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. Sorrel. The mating bond, sealed between them, bright and warm and unbreakable. She felt it settle into her bones, into her blood, into the spaces between her heartbeats. And inside him she felt the wolf settle too, deeper than it had been since before the war, curling into the place where it belonged. For the first time in over a year, man and beast breathed in unison. Sorrel woke to cold. Not the cold of a winter morning or an unlit fire. A deep marrow-level cold that had no source and no boundary, pressing in from every direction like being submerged in dark water. It sank through her skin, through her muscle, through her bones, settling into a place so deep inside her that she could not tell where the cold ended and she began. She opened her eyes and saw gray, fog, thick, still, suffocating. It hung in the air like something solid, swallowing light and sound and distance. The air tasted of ash and wet stone and something older, something that had been rotting quietly beneath the surface for a very long time. The ground beneath her was soft in a way that ground should not be, yielding. Under her weight, like the earth itself, was exhausted, too tired to hold its shape. She knew immediately where she was. Not because she recognized the place, but because the bond told her. It pulsed once, faintly, like a compass needle finding north, and pointed her forward into the fog. "Colder," she called. Her voice fell flat, swallowed by the gray before it could travel more than a few feet. What rushed in to fill the gap was not emptiness. It was full, full of things waiting, full of things listening. She found him ahead of her, standing at the edge of a clearing. He was in human form, shirtless, the mating mark she had left on his shoulder vivid against his skin, the only point of color in the entire gray world. But his posture was wrong. His shoulders were bowed, his head was lowered, his hands hung loose and empty at his sides. The hands of a man who had stopped fighting. And across the clearing, watching him with patient, tawny eyes, was the wolf. It stood separate from him, fully manifested in this place in a way it could not be in the waking world, without tearing them both apart. It was vast here, larger than she had ever seen it, its storm-colored fur, rippling with a light that had no source. It stood at the far edge of the clearing like a sentinel, patient and grieving, and it did not move. Between them lay the dead. Not ghosts, exactly, not spirits or apparitions, impressions, echoes. 43 figures standing in the fog, their forms translucent, their faces turned toward Calder, with expressions that shifted like candlelight, accusation, sorrow, confusion, and, beneath it all, almost invisible, something that might have been forgiveness, if only someone would ask for it. Sorrel's heart clenched so hard she gasped. "This is where you go," she breathed, stepping up beside him. "Every time the wolf separates, every time it pulls free, this is where it brings you." "It does not bring me," Calder said. His voice was hollow, scraped clean. "I bring myself. The wolf just follows to make sure I do not forget." She looked across the clearing at the wolf. Its amber eyes met hers, and in them she saw not anger, not judgment, not the possessive hunger she had seen in the waking world. What she found was anguish. The wolf was not punishing him. It was grieving with him. It had been trying, month after month, to make him face this, to feel it fully, to process the horror and the guilt so they could carry it forward together, and every time he had buried it instead. Locked the wolf down, forced the grief away, refused to mourn, and the wolf, denied its right to grieve alongside the man it shared a soul with, had begun to pull itself free in the only protest it had left. "You think it hates you," Sorrel said. "For what you did at Thornfeld, it should," Calder replied, his voice barely audible. "Look at it," she said, gripping his arm, turning him. "Calder, look at your wolf. Really look." He raised his eyes across the clearing. The wolf took a step forward, then another. Its paws were silent on the yielding ground. It moved slowly, carefully, the way you approach someone who is hurting, and it stopped at the edge of the dead and sat, its tail curling around its feet. And it waited. "It does not hate you," Sorrel said, tears burning in her eyes, her voice thick. "It has never hated you. Not for one single moment. It has been waiting for you to grieve with it. You locked it away because you were afraid of what you would feel if you let it back in. You were afraid that the grief would destroy you. So you walled it off, and walled the wolf off with it, and it has been howling at that wall ever since." Calder's face twisted. A muscle jumped in his jaw. His eyes were overbright. "If I let it in," he said. "Every life, every face, the healer who was trying to reach the wounded, the grandmother who would not leave her house, the girl who," his voice broke, The girl with the dark braids. She was standing in the street when the line advanced. She was holding her mother's hand. Yes, Sorrel said. You will feel all of it, and it will be the worst thing you have ever felt. And you will survive it, because I am here, and the wolf is here, and we are not going to let you drown. She took his hand and placed it over her heart, pressing his palm flat against her chest so he could feel the steady beat beneath his fingers. Feel me, she said. I am right here. I am not leaving. Not now. Not ever. The wolf watched. The fog pressed in from all sides. Calder took one step forward, then another. He walked into the clearing, among the echoes, and Sorrel walked beside him, her hand in his. The figures parted around them like water around stone. Some reached for him as he passed. He did not flinch away. He let them. Their hands passed through his skin and left behind impressions of cold and memory, flashes of lives he had ended, faces he would carry forever, a woman clutching herbs, an old man with kind eyes. A boy too young to understand what was happening. He stopped before the girl. She was small, dark braids, bare feet, standing very still in the fog, her translucent hand held out as though reaching for someone who was no longer there. Calder dropped to his knees. I am sorry, he said. And his voice shattered on the words like glass hitting stone. I am so sorry. I should have waited. I should have listened. I should have found another way, and I did not, and you paid the price. And I am sorry. The girl tilted her head. She studied him for a long, still moment, this king on his knees in the gray world, weeping for her. Then she reached out and placed her small, translucent hand on his cheek. The touch broke something open, not destroyed it. Opened it, the way you open a window in a room that has been sealed too long, letting air rush in where there had been only stale darkness. The grief he had been caging since Thornfeld poured out of him. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body, that bent him forward until his forehead touched the soft, yielding ground. He wept for the dead, for Thornfeld, for the soldiers on both sides who had followed orders into the worst of it, for the wolf he had silenced and the man he had been before the war, and the 18 months he had wasted trying to hold himself together instead of letting himself fall apart. Sorrel held him. She knelt beside him in the wrong ground and wrapped her arms around his shaking body and let him break. She did not try to stop it or fix it or tell him it would be all right. She just held on, the way Marin had held her when she was 9 years old, and crying about parents who had thrown her away, and she let the storm run its course. The wolf moved. It crossed the clearing in 3 long strides, and pressed its forehead against Calder's back. The contact sent a shock through the bond that Sorrel felt in her teeth. The wall between man and beast, the wall he had built during the mountain campaign when he silenced his wolf and chose strategy over mercy, dissolved, not shattered, dissolved, like salt in warm water, simply ceasing to exist. It was not a reunification, it was a reconciliation. 2 halves of the same soul, wounded and grieving and furious and lost, finally turning toward each other and choosing to carry the weight together. The dead began to fade. One by one, they dissolved into the thinning fog, their expressions shifting from sorrow to something softer, something like release, something like peace. The woman with the herbs closed her eyes and breathed out and was gone. The old man nodded once and disappeared. The boy smiled, quick and shy, and vanished into gray. The girl with the dark braids looked at Calder one last time. Her translucent hand lingered on his cheek. Then she smiled, small and fleeting, and impossibly kind. And she was gone. The fog thinned, the cold retreated. The ground beneath them grew solid again, real and firm, and present. Not violently, not with the terrible tearing she had witnessed in the study, but gently, like water returning to a riverbed after a long drought. She felt the bond between the 3 of them flare bright and warm and whole. 3 threads woven into one, inseparable, complete. Calder lifted his head. His eyes were silver. Both of them. Clear and steady and more present than she had ever seen them, as though a film had been lifted and he was seeing the world, seeing her, for the first time. "There you are," Sorrel whispered, cupping his face in her flour-dusted hands. He covered her hands with his own and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt his gratitude through the bond, like sunlight breaking through cloud. They woke tangled together in his bed, in the warm amber light of a fire that had burned low. His arms were around her, his face was buried in her hair. His body was relaxed and whole, and at rest in a way it had not been since before the mountain campaign. Inside him, the wolf stirred, not pulling away, not straining, just settling deeper, curling into the place where it belonged, and letting out a long, contented breath. Sorrel closed her eyes and let the warmth take her. The wolf still stole things. Not out of anguish or desperation or a fractured bond screaming for connection, out of what Sorrel had come to recognize as sheer personality. It took socks from the laundry and deposited them on her pillow in a neat pile. It dragged a velvet cushion from the council chamber and installed it beside her oven, creating itself a permanent nest that no one dared remove. It developed a particular fondness for the kitchen boy's hat and stole it so many times that Braith eventually requisitioned 3 replacements. Once memorably, it stole an entire wheel of aged cheese from the palace pantry and presented it to her in the middle of a formal court dinner, carrying it in its jaws with tremendous pride, and laying it at her feet before the assembled nobility like a dragon presenting its hoard. "Your wolf has no dignity," Braith observed on that occasion, his mouth twitching. "None whatsoever," Calder agreed, but his hand rested on the wolf's head with an ease and affection that still made Sorrel's chest glow, because there had been a time, not so long ago, when he could not touch the wolf without pain, and now they moved together like 2 currents of the same river. Healing was not a straight line. Some nights, Calder woke, gasping, the echoes of Thornfeld still clinging to his skin like fog. On those nights, Sorrel held him, and the wolf pressed close, and together they breathed through it until the memories loosened their grip. He did not try to bury it anymore. He let the grief come, and he let it pass, and each time it passed, a little easier than the time before. He spoke about the dead now, not easily, not without pain, but openly, with the quiet courage of a man who had learned that silence was more dangerous than sorrow. He had commissioned a memorial in Thornfeld, a stone arch inscribed with every name. He visited it himself, every season, and laid wildflowers at the base. The court's reaction to their mating had been predictably scandalized. A baker, a foundling with no bloodline, no family name, no land, no title. A woman with flour permanently embedded in her fingerprints and bread dough under her nails. The whispers had followed Sorrel through every corridor for weeks, sharp and relentless as winter drafts. But Calder had stood before the assembled nobility with Sorrel's hand in his and said very calmly that anyone with objections was welcome to take them up with his wolf, at which point the enormous silver beast had risen to its feet, yawned with theatrical slowness, displayed every single one of its considerable teeth, and fixed the room with a long, two-ton blinking stare that suggested it remembered exactly where the armory was and exactly how long it had growled at that duchess. The objections had died a swift and unanimous death. Now, on a morning like any other, Sorrel woke slowly in the king's bed. Pale gold light filtered through the curtains. Calder slept beside her, his breathing deep and steady, one arm draped over her waist, his face peaceful in a way that still moved her, every time, because she had seen what he looked like without peace, and she would never take this for granted. At the foot of the bed, the wolf dozed in a patch of sunlight, sprawled across the covers, with the boneless abandon of a creature entirely at home. Its head rested on her flour-dusted apron, the same one it had stolen, that first day, torn from her waist, and carried through the palace like a flag of conquest. She had never managed to get it back. She had stopped trying. Sorrel pressed closer to Calder's warmth, felt the wolf's tail thump once in sleepy contentment, and closed her eyes. They slept.